A simple waitress's unexpected gesture in sign language at an upscale restaurant would expose a millionaire family's darkest secret and change everyone's life forever. The crystal chandeliers of Lumiere restaurant cast dancing shadows across the marble floors as Isabella Martinez adjusted her apron for the third time that evening. The prestigious downtown establishment buzzed with the quiet murmur of the city's elite, their conversations flowing as smoothly as the expensive wine being poured at every table. Isabella had been working at Lumiere for 6 months, ever since she'd moved to the city to pursue her dreams of becoming a social worker. The job barely covered her tiny apartment rent, but it was honest work, and she took pride in serving each guest with genuine warmth, something that seemed increasingly rare in this world of calculated conversations and designer everything. As she balanced a tray of crystal glasses, the restaurant's atmosphere suddenly shifted. The maitre d' straightened his posture, the sommelier smoothed his vest, and even the veteran servers seemed to hold their breath. Through the glass doors stepped a man who commanded attention without effort, Marcus Whitfield, the tech mogul whose company had revolutionized digital communications worldwide. Marcus moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room. His tailored suit seemed effortless, his presence magnetic. But Isabella's attention was immediately drawn to the elegant woman walking beside him, an older lady with silver hair pulled into a sophisticated chignon, her posture regal despite her obvious age. The maitre d' rushed forward with practiced deference. "Mr. Whitfield, what an honor to have you dining with us this evening. Your usual table is prepared." Marcus nodded curtly, his arm protectively guiding the older woman through the restaurant. Isabella watched as other diners' heads turned, whispered conversations floating across the room about the unexpected appearance of one of the city's most influential figures. As fate would have it, they were seated in Isabella's section, table 12, the corner table with the best view of the city skyline. Isabella felt her heart rate quicken as she approached, clutching her order pad with sweaty palms. "Good evening," Isabella began with her warmest smile, looking directly at Marcus. "Welcome to Lumiere. I'm Isabella, and I'll be taking care of you tonight." Marcus barely glanced up from his phone. "We'll need a few minutes to look at the menu. Bring us your finest champagne selection to start." Isabella noticed the older woman, who she assumed was Marcus's mother, sitting quietly, her hands folded in her lap, eyes distant. There was something profoundly sad about her stillness, a loneliness that seemed to emanate from her despite being in the company of her successful son. "Of course, sir. And for the lady?" Isabella asked, turning to address the older woman directly. "She doesn't—" Marcus started to answer for her, but Isabella had already shifted her entire body language. Without hesitation, she raised her hands and began signing in fluid, graceful movements. The effect was immediate and electric. The older woman's eyes widened in complete shock, her mouth forming a perfect O of surprise. Around them, the ambient restaurant noise seemed to fade as other guests noticed the unusual interaction unfolding. Isabella's hands moved with practiced elegance. "Good evening. My name is Isabella. It's truly an honor to serve you tonight. How are you feeling?" The transformation in the older woman was breathtaking. Her entire face lit up with a joy so pure and unexpected that it seemed to illuminate the space around their table. Her hands flew up to respond, movements quick with excitement. "I can't believe it. No one has spoken to me in my language in years. I'm Eleanor, and meeting you has already made this the most wonderful evening I've had in so long." Marcus had frozen completely, his phone forgotten in his hand, staring at the interaction with an expression Isabella couldn't quite read. Surprise, certainly, but something else lurking beneath, something that looked almost like fear. Eleanor continued signing with growing animation. "You have no idea what this means to me. My son tries his best, but he never learned to sign properly." "I felt so invisible for so long." Isabella's heart broke a little at those words. She signed back, "You're not invisible to me. Would you like me to tell you about tonight's specials in sign language?" The pure delight on Eleanor's face was infectious. She clapped her hands together like a child receiving an unexpected gift, nodding enthusiastically. As Isabella began describing the evening's menu offerings through sign language, she noticed something strange happening around their table. Marcus had gone completely silent, his usual commanding presence seeming to shrink. His eyes darted nervously between Isabella's hands and his mother's increasingly animated responses. Other diners had begun to notice the unique interaction. Some pulled out their phones discreetly, clearly moved by witnessing such genuine human connection in a place usually reserved for business deals and social climbing. Eleanor signed to Isabella. "You must have learned sign language for someone special." A family member. Isabella's hands paused for just a moment before responding. "My younger brother was born deaf. I learned when I was very young so we could always talk together." "How beautiful," Eleanor signed back, tears beginning to form in her eyes. "What a gift you've given him. And what a gift you've given me tonight." But Marcus suddenly slammed his hand on the table, causing the wine glasses to rattle and drawing stares from nearby tables. "That's enough," he said sharply, his voice cutting through the warm moment like ice. "We don't need all this gesturing. Just bring us the champagne and take our order normally." The harsh tone made Isabella flinch, but Eleanor's reaction was even more telling. She seemed to physically retreat into herself, her hands dropping to her lap as if she'd been scolded. The light that had been shining so brightly in her eyes dimmed instantly. Isabella looked between mother and son, sensing an undercurrent she didn't understand, but feeling protective of the sweet woman who had been so grateful for simple human acknowledgement. "Of course, sir," Isabella replied diplomatically, but she made sure to catch Eleanor's eye and give her a small, reassuring smile before walking away. As she headed toward the bar to get their champagne, Isabella's mind raced. There was something deeply wrong with what she'd just witnessed. Eleanor's joy at being communicated with suggested this was not a common occurrence, and Marcus's aggressive shutdown of their interaction felt controlling in a way that made Isabella's stomach turn. She had no idea that her simple act of kindness had just set in motion a chain of events that would expose secrets buried for decades and change all their lives forever. The champagne Isabella carried back to table 12 felt heavier than usual, weighed down by the tension she'd left behind. She had dealt with difficult customers before, entitled businessmen, demanding socialites, impatient celebrities, but something about Marcus Whitfield's reaction felt different, more personal, more protective of something he was desperate to keep hidden. As she approached their table, Isabella could see Eleanor sitting rigidly, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, while Marcus spoke in low, urgent tones. The magical moment they'd shared seemed like a distant memory, replaced by an atmosphere thick with unspoken conflict. "Your champagne selection," Isabella announced professionally, setting down the elegant bottle and glasses with practiced precision. Marcus looked up, his business smile firmly in place, but Isabella caught the warning in his eyes. "Thank you. We'll have the lobster thermidor for 2, and please ensure we're not disturbed during our meal." It was clearly a dismissal, but as Isabella began to turn away, she felt a gentle touch on her arm. Eleanor had reached out, her eyes pleading. When Marcus looked away to check his phone, Eleanor quickly signed, "Please don't go far. I want to talk more with you." Isabella gave the smallest nod of acknowledgement before walking away, her heart aching for the lonely woman who seemed starved for basic human connection in her own language. From across the restaurant, Isabella kept a watchful eye on table 12 while serving her other guests. She noticed how Marcus dominated the conversation, speaking continuously, while Eleanor sat in silence, occasionally nodding at appropriate moments, but clearly not participating in any meaningful way. It was like watching someone slowly disappear before her eyes. During a brief lull between orders, Isabella's co-worker Jennifer approached her at the service station. "That's Marcus Whitfield over there, isn't it?" she whispered excitedly. "I heard he's worth over $1 billion. His tech company is everywhere. What were you doing with your hands earlier? Everyone's talking about it." "His mother is deaf," Isabella explained simply. "I was just communicating with her." Jennifer's expression shifted to one of surprise. "Really? I've seen him here before with different women. Always assumed they were business associates or dates. I never realized... Wait, if she's deaf, how come I've never seen him use sign language with her?" That question hit Isabella like a cold wave. She'd been wondering the same thing. How could a son not learn to communicate with his own mother? The thought made her stomach turn. As the evening progressed, Isabella found herself creating small opportunities to pass by table 12. Each time, she noticed more troubling details. Eleanor barely touched her food, instead staring out the window at the city lights with a wistful expression. Marcus conducted 2 phone calls during dinner, speaking loudly about business deals while his mother sat ignored beside him. During one of these calls, Eleanor caught Isabella's eye and signed discreetly. He's always working. Even when we're together, we're not really together. Isabella's heart broke a little more. She signed back from across the service area. You deserve better than that. Eleanor's response made Isabella's blood run cold. I used to think so too. But I learned it's easier not to hope for things that will never come. The resignation in those signs, the defeat in Eleanor's posture, sparked something fierce in Isabella's chest. She had grown up watching her parents struggle to ensure her deaf brother Danny never felt excluded, or less than. The idea that this woman, clearly intelligent and capable, had been made to feel invisible in her own family, was unacceptable. As Isabella was refilling water glasses at a nearby table, she overheard fragments of Marcus's phone conversation that made her pause. The Heritage Foundation Board meeting next week. Yes, I'll be giving the keynote on family values and communication. The irony isn't lost on me. No, she won't be attending. She never does. Isabella's hands stilled on the water pitcher. Family values and communication? From a man who couldn't be bothered to learn his mother's language? The hypocrisy was staggering. When Marcus finally ended his call, Isabella approached to clear their plates. Eleanor had eaten perhaps 3 bites of her expensive meal. Was everything prepared to your satisfaction? Isabella asked formally. Fine, Marcus replied curtly, already reaching for his wallet. We'll take the check. But as Isabella reached for Eleanor's barely touched plate, the older woman looked up at her with eyes full of desperate longing. Almost imperceptibly she signed, Help me. The plea was so quiet, so subtle, that Isabella almost missed it. But there it was, a cry for help from a woman who felt trapped in silence within her own family. Isabella's mind raced. What could she possibly do? She was just a waitress, and Marcus Whitfield was one of the most powerful men in the city. But those 2 words, help me, echoed in her mind with increasing urgency. As Marcus handled the payment with typical efficiency, Isabella made a decision that would change everything. She pulled out her order pad and quickly wrote something down, tearing off the small piece of paper. While Marcus was distracted with signing the receipt, Isabella slipped the paper to Eleanor, who palmed it expertly, clearly practiced at hiding things from her son. The note read, Sunrise Cafe on Maple Street, tomorrow 10 a.m. I'll be there if you want to talk. Isabella. Eleanor read it quickly, then looked up at Isabella with tears in her eyes. She nodded almost imperceptibly before tucking the note into her purse. Thank you for dining with us tonight, Isabella said professionally as they prepared to leave. Marcus stood, helping his mother to her feet, with what would have appeared to be gentle courtesy to any observer. But Isabella noticed how his grip on Eleanor's arm was just a little too tight, how his guidance felt more like control than assistance. As they walked toward the exit, Eleanor turned back once to look at Isabella. The gratitude in her eyes was overwhelming, but so was the fear. Isabella realized she might have just put this vulnerable woman in danger, and the weight of that responsibility settled heavily on her shoulders. After they left, Isabella found herself shaking slightly as she cleared their table. Whatever family dynamics she had just witnessed, whatever secrets lay beneath Marcus Whitfield's carefully constructed public image, she was now involved whether she wanted to be or not. The question was, would Eleanor find the courage to meet her tomorrow? And if she did, what terrible truth was she so desperate to share? Isabella arrived at Sunrise Cafe 30 minutes early, her nerves frayed from a sleepless night. The small, cozy establishment on Maple Street was the polar opposite of Lumiere's opulence. Mismatched chairs, local artwork on the walls, and the comforting aroma of fresh-baked pastries. She had chosen it deliberately, hoping the warm, unpretentious atmosphere would help Eleanor feel safe enough to open up. Sitting by the window with a view of the street, Isabella questioned her decision 100 times. What if Eleanor didn't come? What if she did come but Marcus found out? What if she was misreading the entire situation and inserting herself into family dynamics she didn't understand? At exactly 10 o'clock, a taxi pulled up outside. Isabella's heart raced as she watched Eleanor step out, looking around nervously before spotting the cafe. The older woman was dressed more casually than the night before, but her posture still carried that regal bearing Isabella had noticed at the restaurant. Eleanor entered hesitantly, scanning the room until her eyes found Isabella's. The relief that washed over her face was immediate and heartbreaking. She approached the table with quick, determined steps. You came. Isabella signed as Eleanor sat down, tears already forming in both their eyes. I almost didn't, Eleanor responded, her hands slightly shaky. But I couldn't stop thinking about last night. It's been so long since someone saw me, really saw me. Isabella gestured to the menu. Would you like some coffee? Something to eat? Eleanor nodded, and Isabella went to the counter to order for both of them, giving the older woman a moment to collect herself. When she returned with 2 steaming mugs and some fresh scones, Eleanor was staring out the window with that same wistful expression from the restaurant. Thank you for meeting me, Isabella signed, settling back into her chair. I could tell last night that something was wrong. Eleanor's laugh was bitter and silent. Wrong is such a small word for what my life has become. She paused, seeming to gather courage. How much do you know about my son? Only what everyone knows. That he's successful, wealthy, influential, Isabella replied honestly. The great Marcus Whitfield, Eleanor signed, her expression hardening. Champion of communication technology, bringing people together across the globe. Do you know what he said to the press when his company went public? Isabella shook her head. Eleanor's hands moved with increasing agitation. He said his inspiration came from wanting to help people connect when traditional communication failed them. He specifically mentioned having a family member with communication challenges and how that motivated his entire career. Isabella felt a chill run down her spine. He built his fortune on your story. On a lie about my story, Eleanor corrected, her signs sharp with decades of suppressed anger. He never learned sign language, never tried. When I lost my hearing, I wasn't born deaf, it happened when he was 12. He decided I was an embarrassment, something to be hidden away. The words hit Isabella like physical blows. Hidden away? Eleanor nodded, tears flowing freely now. For 30 years, he's kept me locked away in a care facility. Tells everyone I have dementia, that I can't care for myself. Last night was the first time he's taken me anywhere public in over a decade. Isabella's hands frozen mid-sign. The magnitude of what Eleanor was revealing began to sink in. But you're clearly competent, clearly able to— He controls everything, Eleanor interrupted. My finances, my medical care, my entire life. The staff at Willowbrook Manor are paid very well to go along with his version of reality. Most of them don't even know I can communicate in sign language. Willowbrook Manor, Isabella repeated, recognizing the name. It was an exclusive private facility known for caring for wealthy clients with severe cognitive impairments. The only reason I was allowed out last night was because he needed me as a prop, Eleanor continued, her signs becoming more agitated. He's being considered for some humanitarian award, something about technology bringing families together. Having his poor, disabled mother present helps his image. Isabella felt sick. The man she'd served last night, who'd been so dismissive and controlling, was even worse than she'd imagined. Eleanor, that's elder abuse. It's kidnapping. It's perfectly legal, Eleanor signed with devastating resignation. He had me declared incompetent years ago. Bought the right doctors, the right lawyers. On paper, I'm a mentally impaired woman who needs constant supervision. But you're not. Try proving that when every official record says otherwise. When the man making the accusations is one of the most respected businessmen in the country. Eleanor's shoulders sagged with the weight of years of defeat. Isabella's mind raced, trying to process the enormity of what she was hearing. Why are you telling me this? What do you want me to do? Eleanor looked directly into Isabella's eyes, and for the first time since sitting down, her signs were steady and determined. I want you to help me disappear. The words hung in the air between them like a challenge. Isabella felt the weight of Eleanor's desperation, the decades of silence and isolation this woman had endured. I have some money hidden away, Eleanor continued, from before he took control. It's not much, but it's enough to start over somewhere. I don't need luxury. I just need freedom. I need to be seen as a human being again. Isabella's heart was pounding. What Eleanor was asking was enormous, potentially dangerous. Helping her would mean going against one of the most powerful men in the city, risking her own job, possibly facing legal consequences. But then she thought about her brother Danny, about the life he lived surrounded by people who saw his deafness as just one part of who he was, not a limitation that defined him. She thought about the defeat in Eleanor's posture last night, the way she'd shrunk into herself when Marcus silenced their conversation. Where would you go? Isabella asked. Eleanor's face lit up with the first real hope Isabella had seen. "I have a sister in Portland. We haven't spoken in years because Marcus prevented all contact, but she doesn't know what happened to me. If I could just get there." "It's not that simple," Isabella signed, her practical side kicking in. "He'll report you missing. The police will look for you. Not if they think I'm dead." The words sent a shock through Isabella. Eleanor's expression was completely serious. "There's a path through the woods behind Willowbrook. It leads to a bridge over Crescent Falls. People have accidents there sometimes. If they found some of my clothes, maybe my identification—" Eleanor's signs were steady, clearly thought out. Isabella stared at her, realizing this wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision. Eleanor had been planning this for a long time, waiting for the right opportunity, the right person to help her. "When?" Isabella asked, surprising herself with the question. "Sunday afternoon. There's only a skeleton crew on Sundays, and I know the shift schedules. If we time it right." Isabella felt as though she was standing at the edge of a cliff, about to jump into something that would change both their lives forever. But looking at Eleanor's face, seeing hope there for the first time in who knew how long, she realized she'd already made her decision. "What do you need me to do?" The next few days passed in a blur of careful planning and mounting anxiety. Isabella found herself living a double life, serving tables at Lumiere by night, while spending her days researching escape routes, studying Willowbrook Manor's layout, and wrestling with the moral implications of what she was about to do. Eleanor had given her detailed information about the facility during their second secret meeting at a small park across town. Willowbrook Manor sat on 30 acres of manicured grounds, surrounded by woods that connected to the Crescent Falls trail system. The building itself was a converted mansion, with modern security, but Eleanor had observed patterns in the staff rotations, blind spots in surveillance, and most importantly, a service entrance that was rarely monitored on Sunday afternoons. "The beauty of being invisible," Eleanor had signed with bitter irony, "is that people stop watching you very carefully." Isabella had used her day off to drive past the facility, her heart pounding as she took in the imposing structure that had been Eleanor's prison for 3 decades. It looked more like an exclusive resort than a care facility. Perfectly landscaped gardens, elegant architecture, discreet signage. From the outside, it appeared to be exactly what Marcus claimed, a peaceful place for wealthy families to care for their loved ones with dignity. The reality, as Eleanor had described it, was far more sinister. Most of the residents really do have severe dementia or other cognitive impairments, Eleanor had explained during their planning sessions. The staff genuinely believes they're providing compassionate care. Marcus chose this place specifically because the genuine cases provide perfect cover for my situation. On Thursday evening, while serving dinner at Lumiere, Isabella spotted a familiar figure at table 7, Dr. Harrison Wells, Willowbrook Manor's medical director. She recognized him from the facility's website, where he was prominently featured discussing their comprehensive approach to geriatric care. Unable to resist, Isabella volunteered to serve his table. Dr. Wells was dining with what appeared to be his family, a wife and 2 teenage children. As Isabella poured water and took their orders, she listened to their conversation with growing disgust. "The Whitfield family has been so generous to our facility," Dr. Wells was saying to his wife. "Marcus's mother has been with us for years, and his donations have funded our entire new wing. How sad that she has such severe dementia at her age," his wife replied sympathetically. "One of the most tragic cases I've seen," Dr. Wells agreed, cutting into his steak. "Complete cognitive decline, no recognition of family members, requires constant supervision. Marcus visits regularly, of course, but it's heartbreaking to see such a successful man dealing with that burden." Isabella's hands trembled slightly as she refilled their wine glasses. The casual way Dr. Wells spoke about Eleanor's supposed condition, the complete fabrication he was perpetuating, made her feel physically ill. "Is there any hope for improvement?" one of the teenagers asked. "Doctor," Wells shook his head gravely. "I'm afraid not. In cases like hers, we focus on comfort and dignity rather than recovery. The family has accepted that this is how she'll spend her remaining years." The family nodded sympathetically, clearly moved by what they perceived as Dr. Wells's compassionate dedication to his patients. Isabella walked away from their table feeling more determined than ever to help Eleanor escape the web of lies that had trapped her. Friday brought an unexpected complication. Isabella was preparing for her shift at Lumiere when her phone rang. The caller ID showed Marcus Whitfield's number. Somehow he had obtained her personal information. Isabella Martinez? His voice was as cold and commanding over the phone as it had been in person. Yes, sir. How can I help you? I understand you made quite an impression on my mother the other night. I wanted to thank you personally for your attention to her needs. There was something in his tone that made Isabella's skin crawl. A false warmth that barely concealed something much more threatening. Of course, Mr. Whitfield. I was just doing my job. I'm sure you were. I wanted you to know that Mother has been talking about you constantly since our dinner. It seems you've become quite important to her. Isabella's heart raced. Had Eleanor said something? Had Marcus discovered their meetings? She's a lovely woman, Isabella replied carefully. Yes, she is. Which is why I'm very protective of her well-being. You see, Mother has some significant health challenges that require careful management. Sometimes she can become confused, create elaborate stories, even believe things that aren't real. It's part of her condition. The threat was clear, though wrapped in concerned language. Marcus was preemptively discrediting anything Eleanor might have told her. I understand, Isabella said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. I knew you would. You seem like an intelligent young woman who understands boundaries. I trust we won't have any misunderstandings about Mother's limitations. After he hung up, Isabella sat staring at her phone, shaking. Marcus was onto them, or at least suspicious enough to try to intimidate her. The call confirmed everything Eleanor had told her about his control and manipulation. That evening, Isabella managed to get a message to Eleanor through a contact at Willowbrook, a young aide named Carlos, who had always been kind to Eleanor and who was willing to discreetly pass along a note in exchange for what he thought was a charitable donation from Isabella. The message was simple. Sunday still on. He suspects. Be careful. Eleanor's response came back the same way. I'm ready. See you at the bridge. Saturday night, Isabella barely slept. She reviewed the plan obsessively, trying to anticipate every possible complication. Eleanor would create a distraction during the evening medication round, something that would draw the Sunday skeleton crew to the opposite end of the facility. While they were occupied, she would slip out through the service entrance and make her way to the woods. Isabella would be waiting at a designated spot on the trail with clothes, identification documents, and enough cash to get Eleanor to Portland. They would leave Eleanor's institutional clothing and ID bracelet near the bridge, creating the appearance of a tragic accident. By the time anyone realized she was missing, Eleanor would be on a bus to her sister, finally free to reclaim her life. It was a simple plan, which Isabella hoped meant it had the best chance of success. But as Sunday morning dawned gray and drizzling, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into something much more dangerous than either of them anticipated. The clock on her nightstand read 8:47 a.m. In 6 hours, Eleanor Whitfield would either be dead to the world and free to live again, or they would both be facing consequences neither of them was prepared for. Isabella closed her eyes and thought of her brother Danny, of the life he lived surrounded by people who valued and respected him. Eleanor deserved nothing less. It was time to give her that chance. Sunday afternoon arrived with an oppressive humidity that made the air feel thick and charged, as if the weather itself sensed the gravity of what was about to unfold. Isabella parked her car at the Crescent Falls trailhead, her hands trembling slightly as she gathered the supplies she'd carefully prepared over the past week. In her backpack was everything Eleanor would need for her new life. Civilian clothes in Eleanor's size, a prepaid phone, enough cash to last several months, and most importantly, a new identity. Isabella had connected with her cousin Miguel, who worked in social services and had helped undocumented immigrants obtain temporary identification. He'd asked no questions when Isabella requested help for a woman escaping an abusive situation. The trail to the rendezvous point wound through dense forest, the path damp from the morning's rain. Isabella checked her watch obsessively. 2:30 p.m. Eleanor should already be making her move within Willowbrook's walls. 20 minutes later, Isabella reached the designated meeting spot, a small clearing overlooking Crescent Creek, about half a mile upstream from the falls, where they planned to stage Eleanor's accident. The location was perfect, secluded enough to avoid detection, but with clear sightlines to spot anyone approaching. Isabella settled behind a large oak tree to wait, her heart pounding so loudly she worried it might give her away if anyone happened to pass by. The forest was alive with sounds, birds calling, leaves rustling, the distant murmur of water over rocks, but every noise made her jump. At 3:15 she heard footsteps on the trail. Isabella pressed herself against the tree, peering carefully around its trunk. Relief flooded through her as she recognized Eleanor's distinctive silhouette moving carefully through the underbrush. Eleanor looked different out of her institutional clothing. She wore a simple dress and cardigan that somehow made her seem both more vulnerable and more determined. When she spotted Isabella, her face broke into the first genuine smile Isabella had ever seen from her. "You came," Eleanor signed as they embraced quickly. "Of course I came," Isabella replied. "How did you get away?" Eleanor's eyes sparkled with mischief. "I may be 73, but I haven't forgotten how to cause a little chaos. I triggered the fire alarm in the East Wing during medication rounds. While everyone was dealing with that emergency, I walked out the service door like I was taking an evening stroll. How long before they notice you're missing? Night shift change is at 7. They'll probably discover I'm gone during evening medications around 6:30. That gives us about 3 hours." Isabella pulled the backpack off her shoulders and began laying out the supplies. "There's civilian clothing, money, phone numbers for safe houses Miguel connected me with, and this." She handed Eleanor a small manila envelope. Inside was a driver's license and social security card bearing the name Ellen Walsh, close enough to Eleanor's real name that she could respond naturally if someone called her, but different enough to avoid detection. Eleanor stared at the documents with tears in her eyes. "I haven't had my own identity in 30 years, she signed. "I forgot what freedom felt like." "We need to move quickly," Isabella urged, helping Eleanor change clothes behind a screen of trees. "The bus station is 40 minutes away, and the 7 p.m. bus to Portland is your best option. It makes several stops, and you can switch to different routes if needed." As Eleanor finished changing, Isabella carefully arranged the institutional clothing and identification bracelet near the creek bank, making it appear as though someone had undressed before entering the water. The implication would be clear to anyone who found the items. "There's something else," Eleanor said, her signs hesitant. "Something I haven't told you about Marcus." Isabella looked up from arranging the staged evidence, sensing the gravity in Eleanor's expression. "My deafness wasn't from illness or age," Eleanor continued. "Marcus caused it." The words hit Isabella like a physical blow. "What do you mean?" Eleanor's hands shook as she signed the truth she'd kept buried for 3 decades. "When he was 17, we had a fight about his college choices. He wanted to study business, but I thought he had potential for something more meaningful: medicine, education, public service. The argument escalated, and he pushed me down the stairs." Isabella's blood ran cold. "The head injury caused your hearing loss?" "Severe trauma to both eardrums and brainstem damage. The doctor said I was lucky to survive. Marcus told everyone I'd fallen accidentally, and I protected him. He was my son. I thought it was just teenage anger, that he'd grow out of it. But he didn't. He got worse, more controlling. When I started learning sign language and adapting to my new reality, he saw it as an inconvenience. When I began advocating for deaf rights in our community, he saw it as embarrassing. Eventually, he decided the easiest solution was to make me disappear entirely." Isabella felt sick, thinking about the decades of guilt Eleanor must have carried, protecting the son who had not only injured her, but then systematically erased her from existence. "That's why you have to succeed," Eleanor continued urgently. "It's not just about my freedom anymore. Marcus has built his entire empire on lies, about family values, about caring for the disabled, about bringing people together. The world needs to know who he really is." They began walking toward the bridge, where the final stage of their plan would unfold. As they moved through the forest, Isabella's mind raced with the implications of what Eleanor had revealed. This wasn't just elder abuse, it was attempted murder, assault, fraud on a massive scale. "Once you're safe in Portland," Isabella signed, "we can think about how to expose the truth." Eleanor shook her head. "No. Once I'm Ellen Walsh, Eleanor Whitfield is dead forever. I can't come back from this, Isabella. But you can tell my story. You're the only person who knows the truth now. They reached the bridge just as the afternoon light began to fade. The old wooden structure spanned Crescent Creek about 50 feet upstream from where it cascaded into the falls. The sound of rushing water would mask any conversation, and the isolated location made it perfect for their purposes. Isabella helped Eleanor position her belongings near the bridge railing, creating the scene of a tragic accident. Eleanor's institutional bracelet, with her medical information and Marcus's emergency contact details, lay discarded on the wooden planks, as if it had been removed in desperation. "This is it," Eleanor signed, looking back toward the woods that had hidden Willowbrook Manor for so many years. "I'll never see that place again." "Good," Isabella replied firmly. "You deserve so much better than the life he stole from you." They embraced one final time, both women crying freely. Eleanor felt so frail in Isabella's arms, but there was a strength there too, the determination of someone who had endured 3 decades of captivity and was finally choosing freedom. "Thank you," Eleanor signed as they separated. "You've given me back my life." "You gave that to yourself," Isabella replied. "I just helped you remember you deserved it." As Eleanor began the hike toward the main road where Isabella's car was waiting, Isabella remained at the bridge for another 20 minutes, making sure all the evidence was properly positioned. The scene needed to look authentic enough to convince investigators that Eleanor Whitfield had taken her own life in a moment of despair. By the time Isabella reached her car, Eleanor was already changed into her new identity, clutching the bus ticket that would take Ellen Walsh to her sister in Portland. They drove to the station mostly in silence, both women lost in the magnitude of what they'd accomplished. At the bus station, Isabella watched as Eleanor, now Ellen, purchased a small coffee and found a seat in the waiting area. To any observer, she was just another elderly woman traveling to visit family. No one could have guessed they were witnessing one of the most elaborate disappearances in the city's history. The bus pulled away at exactly 7 p.m., carrying Ellen Walsh toward a freedom she'd thought was lost forever. Isabella stood in the parking lot until the taillights disappeared, then began the drive home to wait for the inevitable phone call that would report Eleanor Whitfield's tragic disappearance. Phase 1 was complete. Eleanor was free. Now came the hard part, deciding what to do with the truth about Marcus Whitfield. The call came at 11:47 p.m. just as Isabella was finally drifting off to sleep despite her racing mind. The restaurant's general manager was on the line, his voice tight with unusual urgency. "Isabella, I need you to come in tomorrow morning before your shift. There's been a situation involving one of our guests from earlier this week." She sat up in bed, her heart immediately pounding. "What kind of situation?" "The police want to speak with staff members who interacted with Eleanor Whitfield. I'm told she's missing, possibly deceased. They found her belongings near Crescent Falls." Isabella forced herself to sound appropriately shocked. "Oh my goodness, that's terrible. Of course I'll come in. 10 a.m. sharp. And Isabella? This is obviously very sensitive given who her son is. Discretion is essential." After hanging up, Isabella lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling and replaying every detail of their escape plan. Had they missed anything? Left any trace that could connect her to Eleanor's disappearance? The logical part of her brain knew they'd been careful, but anxiety had a way of magnifying every small detail into potential evidence. The next morning, Lumiere Restaurant looked different somehow, more serious, official. 2 detectives sat in the private dining room that was usually reserved for wine tastings, their presence transforming the elegant space into an impromptu interrogation room. Detective Sarah Martinez, no relation despite the shared surname, was a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s who immediately put Isabella at ease with her direct but compassionate approach. Her partner, Detective James Park, seemed more skeptical, taking notes while studying Isabella's reactions carefully. "We understand you served Mrs. Whitfield last Tuesday evening," Detective Martinez began, consulting her notes. "Can you tell us about that interaction?" Isabella recounted the evening truthfully, describing how she'd noticed Eleanor was deaf and had communicated with her in sign language. She emphasized Eleanor's obvious joy at being acknowledged and Marcus's dismissive behavior. "Did Mrs. Whitfield seem distressed or suicidal to you?" Detective Park asked, his pen poised over his notepad. "Not suicidal," Isabella replied honestly. "Lonely, yes. Sad, definitely. But she seemed, I don't know how to explain it, like she was hungry for human connection, rather than wanting to end everything. The detectives exchanged a look. What made you think she was lonely? Detective Martinez prompted. Isabella chose her words carefully, staying as close to the truth as possible. Her son barely acknowledged her during dinner. He took phone calls, spoke about business constantly, never tried to include her in conversation. She spent most of the evening staring out the window. Did you observe Mr. Whitfield communicate with his mother in sign language? No, never. He seemed to treat her more like an obligation than a family member. Detective Park made another note. Did Mrs. Whitfield attempt to communicate anything specific to you? This was dangerous territory. Isabella had to be truthful enough to seem credible while avoiding any mention of their secret meetings. She thanked me for acknowledging her, said it had been a long time since anyone had spoken to her in her own language. She seemed grateful for basic human courtesy. Anything else? Isabella hesitated, then decided to plant a seed that might help investigators understand Eleanor's state of mind. She did mention feeling invisible, like people had stopped seeing her as a person. Detective Martinez leaned forward slightly. Those were her exact words? In sign language, yes. She said she felt invisible, and that I was the first person in a long time who had really seen her. The detectives spent another 20 minutes going over details, timing, other guests who might have observed the interaction, Isabella's background in sign language. Throughout the questioning, Isabella maintained the persona of a caring server who had been moved by a brief encounter with a lonely elderly woman. One final question, Detective Park said as they prepared to leave. In your opinion, based on that one interaction, do you think Mrs. Whitfield was capable of planning and executing her own disappearance? The question caught Isabella off guard. She'd expected them to assume suicide, not consider the possibility of staged death. What do you mean? We're exploring all possibilities, Detective Martinez explained. Mrs. Whitfield's body hasn't been recovered despite extensive searching. Her belongings were found near the falls, but the positioning seemed almost deliberate. Isabella's mind raced. They were more suspicious than she'd anticipated. She seemed intelligent and aware, Isabella said carefully, but she also seemed very fragile. I can't imagine her having the physical capability or emotional strength to plan something elaborate. It was a calculated response, acknowledging Eleanor's mental acuity while emphasizing her apparent vulnerability. After the detectives left, Isabella tried to focus on her normal routine, but news of Eleanor's disappearance was spreading rapidly through the city's social circles. By evening, it was the lead story on every local news channel. The coverage was exactly what Eleanor had predicted. Marcus appeared at a press conference, playing the role of devastated son to perfection. His voice broke at precisely the right moments as he described his mother's long battle with dementia and his guilt over not recognizing how much she was struggling. She was the most important person in my life, Marcus told the cameras, tears glistening in his eyes. I thought I was protecting her by ensuring she had the best possible care at Willowbrook. I never imagined she was suffering so much that she would choose to end her pain this way. Watching the performance from her apartment, Isabella felt physically ill. Marcus was using Eleanor's supposed death to generate sympathy and reinforce the narrative of his own devotion as a son. The media ate it up. Headlines about tech mogul's tragic loss and family man's private pain dominated the news cycle. But there were other developments that worried Isabella more. An investigative journalist named David Chen had begun digging into the story with uncomfortable persistence. His articles raised questions about the timing of Eleanor's disappearance, the lack of previous suicide attempts or documented depression, and inconsistencies in the timeline of her supposed deterioration. Chen had even managed to interview former Willowbrook staff members who remembered Eleanor differently than her official medical records suggested. One former aide described her as quiet, but clearly aware, while another mentioned seeing her reading books and doing crossword puzzles when she thought no one was watching. 3 days after Eleanor's disappearance, Isabella received another phone call that made her blood run cold. This time it was Marcus himself, calling her personal number again. Miss Martinez, I wanted to thank you personally for your cooperation with the police investigation, he said, his voice carefully modulated. I know my mother's interaction with you was meaningful to her in her final days. I'm very sorry for your loss, Mr. Whitfield. Yes, well, grief is a complicated thing. Sometimes people process loss by creating elaborate fantasies about the deceased. Sometimes they even try to insert themselves into tragedy in ways that can be problematic. The threat was unmistakable. Marcus was warning her against saying anything that might contradict his version of events. I'm not sure I understand, Isabella replied, though she understood perfectly. I'm sure you don't. You seem like a sensible young woman who understands the importance of allowing grieving families their privacy. I trust you'll continue to be sensible. After he hung up, Isabella sat staring at her phone, realizing that their plan had worked almost too well. Marcus was now committed to the narrative of Eleanor's suicide, but he was also clearly suspicious about Isabella's role. Worse, if investigative journalists like David Chen kept digging, they might uncover evidence that would lead back to her. That night, Isabella made a decision that would change everything. She pulled out her laptop and began typing an email to David Chen. If Marcus wanted to play the grieving son while threatening her into silence, she would give the media something much more substantial to investigate. It was time to tell Eleanor's real story. But first, she needed to make sure Ellen Walsh had safely reached Portland and established her new life. Because once Isabella sent that email, there would be no going back for any of them. 2 weeks had passed since Eleanor's disappearance when Isabella finally received the text message she'd been waiting for. Ellen is safe. New life beginning. Forever grateful. M. The message came from Miguel, confirming that Ellen Walsh had successfully connected with her sister in Portland and was beginning to rebuild her life. That confirmation gave Isabella the courage she needed to take the next step. She had spent days crafting a detailed email to investigative journalist David Chen, providing him with everything: Eleanor's real story, evidence of Marcus's fraud, documentation of the systematic abuse that had kept a brilliant woman imprisoned for 3 decades. But before sending it, Isabella had one final task to complete. She requested a meeting with Detective Martinez, claiming she had remembered additional details about her interaction with Eleanor that might be relevant to the investigation. They met at a quiet coffee shop downtown, away from the restaurant and its potential connections to Marcus's influence. I've been thinking about our conversation, Isabella began, her hands wrapped around her coffee mug for warmth and comfort. There were some things Mrs. Whitfield told me that I didn't think were important at the time, but now... Detective Martinez leaned forward, her attention fully focused. What kind of things? She mentioned feeling like a prisoner. At first, I thought she meant emotionally. Trapped by her disability and isolation. But looking back, I think she meant it literally. What made you think that? Isabella took a deep breath, knowing this was the moment of no return. She told me her son had never learned sign language, that he'd kept her isolated from other deaf people and the deaf community. She said she felt like she was being deliberately hidden away. The detective's expression grew more serious. Did she say anything specific about her living situation? She mentioned that she wasn't allowed to have visitors, wasn't allowed to leave Willowbrook without supervision, couldn't make her own medical decisions. She described it as living in a beautiful prison. Detective Martinez made careful notes, then looked up with sharp eyes. Miss Martinez, why didn't you mention these details during our original interview? Isabella had prepared for this question. Honestly, because they sounded so extreme, I thought they might be delusions or exaggerations. But then I started researching Marcus Whitfield's public statements about disability advocacy and family values, and the disconnect bothered me. A man who supposedly cares so much about communication and bringing families together, but he never learned to communicate with his own deaf mother. The detective studied Isabella for a long moment. Are you suggesting Mr. Whitfield was somehow responsible for his mother's death? I'm suggesting that maybe Mrs. Whitfield wasn't as mentally impaired as everyone believed. And maybe her death wasn't suicide. Maybe it was escape. The words hung in the air between them. Detective Martinez closed her notepad slowly, her expression thoughtful. Miss Martinez, I need you to understand something. What you're implying about Mr. Whitfield is very serious. Do you have any evidence beyond one conversation with his mother? Isabella shook her head. No direct evidence. Just the feeling that something was very wrong with that family dynamic. I appreciate you coming forward with this information. We'll certainly look into it further. As they parted ways, Isabella knew she had planted the seeds of doubt that might eventually grow into a real investigation. but she also knew it wouldn't be enough on its own. Marcus Whitfield was too powerful, too well-connected, too skilled at controlling narratives, which was why, that evening, Isabella finally sent her email to David Chen. The response came back within hours. Chen wanted to meet immediately. They arranged to meet at a small diner across town, where Chen listened with growing amazement as Isabella provided him with the detailed account of Eleanor's true story. "This is enormous," Chen said when she finished. "If even half of what you're telling me is true, it's not just elder abuse, it's fraud, false imprisonment, possibly attempted murder. The public needs to know. But you'll need more than just my word," Isabella pointed out. Chen smiled grimly. "I've been investigating Whitfield for months, ever since his mother's disappearance. There are inconsistencies in the medical records, discrepancies in the timeline of her supposed cognitive decline, and former Willowbrook employees who remember Eleanor very differently than her official diagnosis suggests." "Darn, what kind of discrepancies?" "For starters, Eleanor was supposedly diagnosed with severe dementia 15 years ago, but her medical records from before that show no signs of cognitive impairment. In fact, she was advocating for deaf rights and serving on non-profit boards until the day she was committed." Isabella felt a chill of vindication mixed with horror. He had her declared incompetent when she was perfectly healthy? It looks that way. And there's more. Whitfield's company has received millions in government contracts specifically for developing communication technology for disabled communities. He's used his mother's supposed condition to position himself as an advocate, but there's no evidence he's ever actually worked with deaf organizations or contributed to deaf causes. Chen pulled out a tablet and showed Isabella a series of documents: financial records, medical reports, correspondence between Marcus and Willowbrook administrators. "I've been building a case, but I needed someone who could verify Eleanor's actual mental state. Your account of communicating with her in sign language, of her expressing complex thoughts and emotions, that's the missing piece. When will you publish?" "Tomorrow morning. The story goes live at 6 a.m., and I'm told it's going to be front page above the fold." That night, Isabella barely slept. She knew that once Chen's story broke, her life would change forever. Marcus Whitfield would know she was the source, and his retaliation would be swift and merciless. But she also knew that Eleanor, now Ellen, was finally safe, finally free to live the life that had been stolen from her. At exactly 6 a.m., Isabella's phone began buzzing with news alerts. Chen's story had exploded across social media and news networks. Tech mogul accused of imprisoning mother for decades. Investigation reveals pattern of abuse, fraud, and manipulation. The article was devastating in its detail. Chen had corroborated Isabella's account with testimony from former Willowbrook staff, analysis of medical records that showed no evidence of dementia, and financial documentation proving that Marcus had profited from his mother's supposed condition while providing her with no actual advocacy or support. Most damaging of all was the revelation that Eleanor had been a prominent deaf rights advocate before her sudden disappearance from public life, and that several organizations had attempted to contact her over the years, only to be told by Marcus that she was too ill to receive visitors. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Marcus's company stock plummeted as investors fled. The board of directors announced an emergency meeting to discuss his future with the company. Law enforcement agencies in 3 states opened investigations into elder abuse, fraud, and embezzlement. But for Isabella, the most meaningful response came in the form of a handwritten letter that arrived 3 days later, postmarked from Portland. "Dear Isabella, I have been watching the news coverage with tears of joy. 30 years of silence have finally been broken. My sister Sarah, she's changed her name too for safety, wants you to know that you didn't just save my life. You saved my soul. I am learning to be Ellen Walsh, and it is wonderful. Yesterday, I went to a deaf community center for the first time in decades. I am making friends, volunteering with other seniors, even considering taking college courses I never had the chance to complete. Thank you for seeing me as a human being when the rest of the world had forgotten I existed. Marcus will probably try to hurt you for this. But remember, he can't touch the truth anymore. The world knows who he really is now. Your friend forever, Ellen, who was once Eleanor." A week later, Marcus Whitfield was arrested on charges of elder abuse, fraud, embezzlement, and criminal confinement. The investigation had uncovered evidence that he had been systematically stealing from Eleanor's estate while claiming her care expenses, had forged medical documents to support her false diagnosis, and had threatened staff members who questioned his mother's treatment. Dr. Harrison Wells and 2 other Willowbrook administrators were also arrested for their roles in the conspiracy. Isabella received death threats and harassment from Marcus's supporters, but she also received hundreds of messages from people thanking her for her courage. Advocacy organizations for the deaf and elderly invited her to speak about recognizing and reporting abuse. The restaurant where she worked became a symbol of social justice, drawing customers who wanted to support the young woman who had risked everything to save a stranger. 6 months later, Isabella used the reward money from a whistleblower lawsuit to enroll in graduate school for social work, specializing in advocacy for deaf and disabled communities. Her brother Danny, who had followed the entire story with pride, convinced her to write a book about Eleanor's story and the broader issues of elder abuse and disability rights. Marcus Whitfield was convicted on all charges and sentenced to 25 years in prison. His tech empire collapsed, and his fraudulent advocacy programs were exposed and dismantled. The money recovered from his schemes was used to fund legitimate programs supporting deaf rights and elder care reform. Eleanor Whitfield was officially declared dead, her funeral attended by hundreds of people who mourned the loss of a woman they had never truly known, but whose story had touched their hearts. Ellen Walsh attended that funeral, disguised among the mourners, saying goodbye to the identity that had been stolen from her so she could fully embrace the life she had reclaimed. In her victim impact statement, read by proxy since Eleanor was officially deceased, she wrote, "My son took 30 years of my life, but he could not take my spirit. Thanks to one young woman who saw my humanity when others saw only disability, I am free to live the rest of my years with dignity, purpose, and joy. That is the most precious gift anyone has ever given me." Isabella still works in restaurants occasionally, but now she also travels the country training servers, healthcare workers, and social service providers to recognize signs of abuse and to see beyond disabilities to the human beings who deserve respect, communication, and freedom. She carries with her a small photo that Ellen sent from Portland, a picture of Ellen volunteering at a deaf community garden, her face radiant with the joy of someone who has finally come home to herself. Every time Isabella looks at that photo, she remembers that sometimes the most important thing you can do for another human being is simply to see them, acknowledge them, and believe they deserve better than the life someone else has chosen for them. Eleanor Whitfield died at Crescent Falls on a rainy Sunday afternoon. But Ellen Walsh was born from that death, and she is living proof that it's never too late to reclaim your life, your voice, and your dignity. The last entry in Ellen's diary, which she shared with Isabella months later, read, "Today I realized something important. I didn't lose 30 years of my life to Marcus. I invested them in learning how precious freedom really is. Now every day I wake up free feels like a miracle. And it all started with a young woman who took the time to say hello in my language.